A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. If you need a website or a domain, go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase. Hello everybody, how's it going? Hope you're all well. This is a snowman sticker that Noah gave to me this morning, and I did suggest taking it off for the filming of this video, but he made it very clear he disagreed with that strategy, so here we are. Future me, hello, I've just finished recording this video. I forgot to say that my presets are on sale for the next week. Details in the description, but basically use this discount code and you'll get half price presets. Thank you for your support. Let's get on with the editing. Yesterday, I put a story, that's the word I'm looking for, a story on Instagram asking if anybody had any editing questions. I said I was going to film an editing video, and thankfully lots of people sent me questions. So if one of those was you, a big thank you to you. And there were some quite niche questions, but by and large, most of the questions followed a few sort of broad themes. So I thought I'd go through some of those themes today in the hope that it's helpful to the biggest number of people. Also in that story, I featured this photo, which I think explains why so many of the questions were about like a softness, like a dreamy look, like a glow, and how to achieve that. So, seems a reasonable place to start. So, there's a few things going on in this photo. A couple of them atmospheric, which help give this soft, glowy look. There was a bit of haze around that morning, and also it's quite a heavy sea and there's no wind, so there's quite a lot of sea spray in the air as well. And naturally those things are going to lower the contrast and make for a bit of a bloomy look. But the rest of the heavy lifting, I would suggest, is being done by negative clarity. And if I was in charge of the clarity slider at Lightroom, I would make sure that it started at 0 and that you couldn't go right of that. I'd basically have it at 0 and then only make it possible to have negative clarity. I think positive clarity always looks absolutely disgusting, personally. And if you don't know exactly what clarity is, most editing software has some sort of clarity feature. They're sometimes called different things. But basically it's adding contrast in the midtones specifically. And yeah, more often than not, I just don't think it looks particularly nice at all. And so in the vast majority of my photos, I would say, I am employing some degree of negative clarity to get rid of some of the contrast in the midtones. So yeah, if clarity is at 0, it looks like this on this particular photo. If it's down at -43, it looks like that. Significantly nicer, I think. In fact, we can use this photo for lots of the areas that people asked about. So one of the other things that people asked about was exposure and whether I shoot for my edit. Basically, I always, despite having very bright skies in the majority of my photos, I try and retain as much detail while I'm shooting as I possibly can. Because in scenes like this, everything's happening very, very quickly, and I don't want to make a decision that I'm then potentially going to regret after the fact. So I try and capture as much detail as possible in the file, so I'm not blowing my highlights, and then that gives me the greatest possible flexibility in post. And in post, my histogram often looks like this, so I'll have lots of very, very bright parts of the image, but nothing really that's clipped, so to speak, so nothing that's pure white. And yeah, that's typically how my photos look. However, when that is the case, I pretty much always also have something that's really quite dark, because that is what stops the photo looking overexposed. So, you know, if I had shadows, let's just push my shadows up on this shot. If I had shadows like that, it would look pretty disgusting and overexposed really quite quickly. And also, there's absolutely no need for it, because in this example, all I'm doing by raising the shadows is showing detail that adds nothing to the scene. I mean, look at the underside of this boat. Why would I want to draw attention to that and therefore away from some of the more interesting parts of the frame? So if I just bring the shadows back down, it means that there's no detail in those shadows, but as far as I'm concerned, that's a good thing, because I want people looking in the more interesting parts of the frame. Glow, exposure, sharpening. People often, I think too much about sharpening. There's a bit of a meme among some of us photography YouTubers that if you want views, you just make a video about sharpening, because lots of people are obsessed with it. But actually, I think beginners in particular think about sharpening way too much and conflate a sharp photo with a good photo. Is conflate the right use of the word there? I don't know. But they think of those two things as the same, and they're really, really not. In any case, I can show you how I very quickly sharpen my photos, if at all. So let's zoom in here, and let's just focus on the fisherman's face and this front portion of the boat here. I think they can act as a pretty good proxy for overall sharpness. Let's go down to detail, and you can see I've got a reasonable amount of sharpening going on here, 72. And you can also see what it's doing if I take it off. The photo looks significantly less sharp, I think. Hopefully that comes through via a screen record and YouTube compression. I don't know if it will, but basically there is a reasonable amount of difference there. What's important though about sharpening, I would suggest, is masking. It's the most important part of sharpening, because if I take the masking off, then hopefully what you can see is essentially lots of sharpening in places that I don't want sharpening. Essentially the software is looking all over the image regardless of whether it's edges or not, and it's trying to find detail even in places where there isn't detail, and you don't want there to be lots of detail. So if you look at this bit here, or all along this green bit of the boat, essentially I've introduced what looks like noise, quite a lot of noise into the shot, because the software is hunting for detail where there isn't any. And I can get rid of that very easily by pressing Option on my Mac keyboard, dragging the masking along to make sure that the only places I have white are the edges where I actually want sharpening to be applied. And something like that looks pretty good. It's quite a lot of masking, 82. But to me, that looks pretty good. I've got sharp edges, but I've not got sharpness where I don't want sharpness. And because people often neglect the masking, what they then end up doing is spending lots of time dealing with denoising, because they're looking at their shot and thinking, oh, it looks fantastically sharp, but I've got all this grain and noise that I don't want. I'll have to denoise it. It's often not necessary, particularly if you're shooting at low ISOs in the day. You don't really need to be messing around with denoising too much if you sharpen correctly, if you want to sharpen at all. You might be able to hear a 3-year-old screaming. I apologise if you can. Luminance, lots of questions on luminance as well. Let's go to some other photos to look at that. So typically when we think about editing colour, particularly when we're beginners, we think mostly about saturation, the intensity of the colour. We don't necessarily think about the colour of the colour, that is the hue, and we really don't think about the luminance of the colour, which is the brightness. But the luminance of the colour, I think, is what does most of the heavy lifting where colour is concerned. So if we look at this photo, for instance, you can see that there are 2 or 3 sliders where I've made some changes to luminance. Orange, if I just bring that down, you can see what that does. Essentially changes how the road that this lady is on appears. And because I want to accentuate her shadow and almost mirror the tone of the sky and the road, I want to bring the luminance of the orange up. The luminance of the yellow I want to bring up because I want these verges nice and bright. You see if I bring that down, the effect it has, I want them high. And the green, actually we can talk about green more broadly because I'm not the biggest fan of really punchy greens in my photo. So typically I take the saturation of the greens down in my images, and normally also I either move the luminance up or down, but I very rarely keep it neutral. And that's because I want my greens to have impact, but just not necessarily through their vibrancy. So in this instance, I've turned the luminance of the greens all the way down, just to act as a point of difference from the background, I guess. If I was to move the luminance of the greens up, then they wouldn't look as punchy against the sky, you can see in these bushes. So I'll just bring them down again, and I quite like the look of that. Another photo that might be worth looking at while we're talking about luminance is one I took a couple of days ago here in Wales. Obviously this is not Vietnam, and this might feature in the next video, but I think I quite like this photo. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, but you can see, because of how I've edited it, that this building almost looks like it's floating. There's not really any shadow around it, which I don't particularly like, and I can use luminance to change that. So if I bring down the luminance of the blue, I can basically bring the shadows back, which I think looks a lot better. And so yeah, when it comes to colour, luminance is what I focus on more than anything else. And also actually on that point, I did have a few questions about colour accuracy and how much I pay attention to colour accuracy, how much I want my photos to mimic what the scene actually looked like versus having some sort of artistic vision for them. Now as far as colour accuracy goes, I'm not massively fussed about it, to be honest, because a lot of the most impactful work that's ever been shot was shot on black and white. which is to say it had 0 colour accuracy. But that said, I do want to work within the bounds of what is reasonably realistic, what a scene could have looked like, and I want to push right up to the edge of those boundaries, but ultimately I want to look at my photos and think, yeah, it could have looked like that. Also, I had lots of questions about blues and how to edit blue sky days. But to be honest, most of the work when it comes to blue skies is done in the field by way of choosing what it is that I'm shooting on blue sky days. Typically, I take myself out of sort of mountainous areas or areas where I'm going to have lots of natural, which is to say messy, harsh shadows. And so on blue sky days, typically I head for the coast and I work on beaches, places like that, where you've got big, flat, wide expanses where you're not going to have lots of really harsh natural shadows. And in truth, that often does a lot of the heavy lifting for me. Because then if you're working with things like buildings where you have much more uniform shadows, everything I think tends to look quite a lot nicer. But also, as a rule, even if I'm in places like that, I tend to up the luminance of the blue and take down the saturation of the blue a little bit as well. That's just a stylistic preference, but yeah, that's typically how I handle blues on blue sky days. Masks. Let's talk about masks. Lots of people asked me about local adjustments, how I go about it, etc. As a rule, I would say I try and avoid local adjustments as much as I possibly can. They're very powerful. It makes lots of sense in some cases to use them. But the thing is, your eyes and your brain are so well attuned to micro differences in contrast and how much contrast a subject should have versus a background, all that kind of stuff, that I think you have to be really, really careful, because if people pick up that there's something not quite right about your scene or the difference between your subject and the background or whatever, your photo's ruined as far as I'm concerned. So I like to use them in very specific circumstances. I use them very, very tentatively as well. In any case, I can show you an example of how I would use a mask in a scene like this. So basically, I have got the background selected. This isn't how the photo looked. I'll show you how the photo looked. If I select the mask, I've got a lot of dehaze on everything that's not the subject, which is the boat basically. So if I move it back to something like how it should look, that. If I wanted to add some haze to the background, I could do so by bringing down the dehaze, like so. But the problem with doing this is that it looks completely unrealistic. The reason it looks unrealistic, mostly, is that essentially contrast decreases the further away from the camera something is. And so when I see beginners edit photos, this is one of the biggest mistakes that they make. They try and increase contrast or keep contrast right the way through a scene from something very close to the camera right the way through to infinity. And it just looks very, very unrealistic if you've got mountains all the way in the background of a shot that have got lots and lots of contrast. That's not how the world looks. And so you want to typically lose contrast the further away from the camera something is. And so in this setting, for example, it sort of makes sense that you'd have less detail in the background where this church is in these buildings versus the boat. I mean, maybe not to this extent, but for this example, let's just go with it. Maybe something like that makes a bit more sense. But this mask is doing a pretty horrible job at the moment because it's not accounting for the fact that you lose contrast the further away from the camera you get. There is more contrast in this boat, for instance, now than there is in the foreground, everything before the boat. That doesn't make sense. So what I can do is solve that by intersecting this mask with a linear gradient. And if I pull that down, then hopefully, essentially everything behind the boat will remain affected. Meanwhile, everything below this bottom line won't be. So you maintain the contrast in the foreground, but you lose contrast the further away you get from the camera. Meanwhile, the subject isn't affected because we've masked the subject out. I don't know if you can see this mask here. So that is typically how I would deal with masking. You need to be very, very careful to maintain contrast in the right places. But so long as you remember that golden rule and you tread lightly with masks, they can be very powerful. Anyway, I think that is basically the major areas of questioning that I I received about editing. If you've got other questions, do let me know. Perhaps I'll do a follow-up at some point. But a big thank you for watching and send in any questions if you did so. And also a huge thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. So this week I've been adding more of the Vietnam photos to my portfolio, which is my Squarespace website. And I've used that website for the past 7 or 8 years, and I think it's fantastic. And I think it's the perfect solution for all photographers to showcase our work online. There are so many different templates to choose from. You don't need to worry about how to resize images or code or anything like that. And it's an integral part of my business. And my presets that I mentioned earlier are on my website. And setting up things like discount codes, writing newsletters, selling my book, which I've been super busy with for the past couple of months. All of that takes place through my Squarespace website, and I couldn't live without it. So if you're a photographer, and I'm guessing you are if you've got this far into the video, and you fancy checking out Squarespace, then you can do so for free with a free trial by going to squarespace.com. And after that, if you'd like to make a purchase, just go to squarespace.com/James and you'll get 10% off that first purchase. So a huge thank you to Squarespace for their continued support of this channel, and thank you to you for watching. And yeah, again, hopefully this was helpful. I'll see you next time. Cheers.